This is another very exciting chess game. This game was taken from the Wijk aan Zee Tournament 2013. Aronian Levon is playing the white side, and Anand Viswanathan is playing the black side. This is probably one of the best games that I have ever seen. Anand is an extremely good Grandmaster, and this game is very brilliant. c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, e6. So here we have the Semi-Slav Defense being played by Anand. It's very solid. e3, and this is a typical move looking to get the bishop developed and castle kingside. Now, black plays knight b to d7. The idea in the Semi-Slav is to delay taking on c4 until white develops this bishop. That way, once white has developed the bishop, black could then take on c4 and gain a tempo on this bishop with b5. So here we see bishop out to d3 being played immediately. An alternative is to play queen out to c2 to try and delay moving the bishop just to see what black does, and then maybe moving the bishop later. Alright, so let's go ahead and take a look at the some more moves. Bishop d3 is played, d takes c4, bishop takes, and b5. And the Semi-Slav e6 is played, which prevents this bishop from developing out normally this way. So therefore b5 is played in order to get the bishop developed out via b7. Bishop d3, bishop d6 castles, and now we see queen out to c2. This is a popular move just to put some pressure on h7, bishop out to b7, and here Anand is preparing to play c5, which would be a liberating move, allowing this bishop on b7 to become very active. And notice that both of these bishops are being aimed at white's king. So if black could get in c5, then he could have a very good attacking game. a3, this is a useful move trying to stop b4 from being played. And the idea here is that Anand would love to play a6 to support b5 and then play c5. That is one way to do it. Another way to do that would be simply to play b4, hitting this knight on c3, causing it to move, and then playing c5. a3 stops that idea. So now Anand will have to try and play c5 some other way. It is possible to play a6 here. That is typically played, but white could always play b4, and then this will be a little bit difficult for black to get this bishop on b7 active. If he can get this bishop to become really active, then he'll have a good game. b4 looks to lock down the c5 square and could also give white a good outpost for his knight on c5 at some point. So b4 is a useful move, and here if black were to play a5, then essentially he played a7, a6, a6, a5, and therefore has lost a tempo. So that is not ideal. It would be better to play a5 in one move. Not to mention, even if a6, b4 is played, here Anand could try a5 to look at opening up the position, but a6, the pawn on a6 was defending b5. Now there is not a defender for b5, so it makes c5 even harder to play. And you can see that this bishop on b7 can become very passive pretty quickly, which would allow white to dominate the game. So therefore, Anand plays something different, and he had this prepared. He plays rook out to c8, which is the start of this very brilliant game. The rook prepares a c5 break anyway. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. Why could c5 be played anyway? Well, let's just say that white plays b4 here, looking to stop c5. Anand could play it anyway. This did not happen in the actual game, but this is what could have happened. In the actual game, instead of b4, knight g5 was played, and we will come back to this in just a minute. But let's go ahead and take a look at why b4 doesn't really matter here. How can black play c5? This is extremely brilliant. Alright, so let's just say takes on c5. Then bishop takes f3. G takes f3. Well, there's a couple of different options. Either G takes f3 or C takes d6. Let's take a look at C takes d6 first. Here we will see knight g4, and this move allows black to equalize. He is currently down a pawn in this position, but even though he's down by a pawn and possibly down by a second piece if the bishop on f3 is captured, or actually down by one piece if the bishop on f3 is captured, even though that is the case, notice that white has two pieces which are undeveloped, and this allows black to quickly attack. So let's take a look at bishop h7 first. King h8, bishop d3, knight takes h2. Okay, so what to do here? If G takes f3, knight takes f3, check, check, and then we see this perpetual check. There is no way for white to get away from that. So that is one variation. So instead of taking on h7, let's try another variation. What about rook to b1? It looks like a decent move. The rook was not developed, and now we're trying to put it on the file where it can do some damage. So it makes sense. But then knight h2, very brilliant move, just attacking the rook. A couple of options here. If G takes f3, f5, e4, f4, and black will at the very least have a draw here, mainly because white's king is not able to move away. So if e5, trying to get some space, then queen g5 check would give black at least a draw. Also knight f3 check is possible, and this would lead to a very complicated game. Black could play rook out to f5 here, and we see that white's king is not able to move this direction. Rook out to g5 is a threat, so white would be in a lot of trouble here. Alright, so that is one possibility also, and that was just simply playing the rook out to b1 and then knight h2. Black's attack comes very quickly here. It is extremely difficult to deal with. So what about another move such as G takes f3? Well, then we see queen h4 with the idea of checkmate, and if white takes the knight to stop the checkmate, then we get this perpetual check. So that is a pretty awesome way to save the game. Alright, so in that variation we looked at C takes d6, and Anand is perfectly okay, just knight g4, and he would be able to draw the game. But what about G takes f3? Well, then we get this double sacrifice. Knight takes c5. What else can you do? You pretty much would need to take it. If you don't take it, then black will be in a much better position. White's pawn structures on the king side are ruined. And in addition to that, this bishop and rook are undeveloped, plus this rook is pinning this knight to the queen, so it is best to go ahead and take the knight. Otherwise, white will be in a lot of trouble here. So taking the knight, but then we see rook out to c5. And here the idea is to take on h2 and shuffle this rook back and forth with a perpetual draw. So if bishop out to b2 here, then taking on h2 allows a draw. I mean, where does the king move? King moves here, we have a check here. If the king does move too far up the board, then it runs the risk of being checkmated. So that's not good. Therefore, the king would just move back and forth and it would be a draw. Alright, but what if the king doesn't take the bishop? How about king h1? Well, then knight to d5, and black has the advantage here. Black is currently up by a pawn. It looks like actually 2 pawns. Has pressure on the c3 knight, and queen out to h4 is possible. Actually, black is down by a piece, up by 2 pawns, so it's currently down by a pawn, but white's king is in a lot of trouble here. So black should have a very good game. Not to mention, he could also pull the bishop back and put a ton of pressure on this knight. There are various ways to play this. Alright, so moving the king over is not best. Black has enough compensation for the piece and is probably winning in that scenario. So after bishop takes f3, we looked at g takes f3, knight takes, pawn takes back, rook takes, and here we looked at bishop out to b2. But what about f4, just trying to close off this dark squared bishop? Well, then we would see knight d5, and we're essentially just going to pile up on this bishop. White tries to defend it, but at the end of the day, he runs out of defenders, and black is able to capture back his piece. Then we get into an endgame that is equal. Black would probably have a slight advantage because of this passed pawn, but since it's bishops of opposite color, I could easily see a draw here. Alright, so let's go ahead and head back to the actual game. Over here we had seen a3 being played. After a3, rook to c8, and then we looked at what would happen if b4 was played, and we saw that c5 was good for Anand, and at least equal, which allows his bishop to get into the game. That is a really amazing idea. But in the actual game, we saw knight to g5 instead, just looking to go after h7. Here, the best move is to play c5 and activate this bishop. Now, Anand here could win a pawn with bishop takes h2, king takes knight g5, or g4 rather, king moves back, queen takes knight. So this would allow Anand to win a pawn. Well, white could take on h7 and then it'd be equal material, but f3 is probably a little bit better to try and stop black's attack. Knight g to f6, b4. And the point here is that this bishop on b7 is going to be extremely passive for the rest of the game. It would have to move back to c8, and then maybe a move like e5 could be played. Then the bishop could possibly get out to e6, but that takes several moves, which allows white to get his attack going. Not to mention white has all of this space in the center. So this would have been very difficult for black to play. Even though he is a pawn up, it's probably not worth it because of his bishop being locked in. Therefore, the bishop is given a lot of space with c5 instead. So instead of playing bishop takes h2, we see c5. This is the best move. Piece activity is extremely important in chess. Knight takes h7 here, and it is just going in for the attack. Knight g4. Anand had actually prepared this move in his analysis. Piece activity in chess can be worth more than material. So black is not concerned about this rook on f8. He's simply going in for the attack. And look at these bishops. They're doing really well, controlling a lot of space. The queen could come out to h4. White has to be very careful here. Now f4 is played in the actual game. The idea here is to block out one of the bishops. That is a useful move. There are other possibilities here. Let's take a look at knight takes f8. I mean, why not grab the extra material? Well, if that does happen, bishop takes, king moves over, queen h4, and white is going to be lost. There's a huge checkmate threat here, probably can't be stopped. If something like f4 is played, then the end is very quick. So maybe the rook would have to move over, but that's not that much better either. Knight f2 should also work. Alright, so that is why taking on f8 is not good. What about h3? h3 is a possibility, just looking to drive back the knight. Well, this is extremely complicated. Bishop h2, the idea here is to get the bishop by the king, so that in case f4 is ever played, the dark squared bishop is not blocked out like it would be on d6. It is able to attack the king because it's already on the king's side. So f4 would not be useful here in blocking out the bishop. After king h1, queen h4, and there's a couple of ideas here. Maybe d5, just trying to block out the light squared bishop, and maybe f3 here, let's say, just trying to get rid of the knight. c4, and this gets very complicated. The attack would happen very fast. D takes on e6, queen g3, this threatening checkmate. The king has to move over, that's pretty much the forced. Queen h2 check, and we see that black's attack is just crashing through. If king e2, bishop takes bishop, knight takes queen check, and the attack is going to continue at this point. The material is equal. Not to mention, white still has two pieces undeveloped. So this is very intense. If maybe what happens if bishop takes here, well, then queen could take with check. That is one idea, just driving the king back. And then you have ideas of check here, king moves over, maybe check here. It gets pretty bad pretty fast. So as you can see, this attack is very fast paced. Let's go ahead and take a look at some more variations. What about, we looked at f3 here, we saw that didn't really work out that well. Why not f4? If f4, b4 is an idea, just looking to try and win some material here on the c file and opening up the game a little bit to continue the attacks. Knight g5, queen takes here on h3, the pawn can't take because bishop is pinning it to the king. And here, if knight to g5, just trying to drive away black's queen actually, trying to drive away the queen. g2 is currently protected by the white queen. So queen h4, and then the game would continue from here. There's a lot of checkmate threats. Ideas like moving the bishop out here to g3 are possible. This game is very complicated. This knight's going to fall at some point. Black is simply winning here. This is a crushing attack. Even if black is down material in this variation, this rook and bishop are not participating at all. And the attack is just going to continue forward. Alright, let's take a look at some more possibilities. We looked at d5 in that variation. Why not bishop e4? Just trying to trade off some material. If white can trade off enough material, then the attack will be much easier to handle. So that is a logical move. Here we see f5, queen takes e6, king takes h7, and this is pretty much the forced. Then bishop out to b8. The idea here is to play moves like knight f2 check and try to get a queen into g6 for a checkmate on h7. That is one idea. f4 is played. We see knight f2 check, king h2, and f4 is a good move, trying to block out this dark squared bishop so that queen g6 or rather g3, would not lead to checkmate on h2. So c takes d4, queen takes, rook f to d8, and here black has not won all of his material back. He is still down by 2 pawns, but once again white has 2 pieces that have not developed yet, and the attack is going to continue from here. It'd be very difficult to stop this. Alright, so that's just a quick run through of what could happen. The position is immensely complicated. Let's go ahead and take a look at what happened in the actual game. So Aronian basically had to sit here and calculate all those possible variations, and he saw that f4 was probably his best bet. C takes d4 is played by Anand, a great move. It's difficult to see, but essentially it is going to open up the center a little bit more, makes the c3 knight harder to move so that it cannot as easily defend the king's side. This rook is pinning the knight to the queen. He takes d4, bishop c5, another sacrifice. Anand is able to sacrifice so much because white has 2 pieces that are not participating in the game. Not to mention, this knight is not going to be able to help with defense for a long time. It's kind of on the edge of the board. Not to mention, black's bishops are aimed at the king's side. The knight is over here. The queen could jump in. The rook could come down the c-file. All of these pieces are coming in pretty fast. Alright, so let's go ahead and take a look at bishop to c5. Bishop e2 was played in the actual game, so why not just take on c5? Why not just take the bishop? Well, then black would play knight takes c5, looking to regain his piece by taking on d3. So what to do here, how to handle this? If bishop moves out to b5, just trying to avoid losing the piece. Then queen b6, king h1, looking to get out of discovered check. Knight e4, knight takes f8, knight f check check, king out to g1. If the rook doesn't take here, maybe the king moves over, then knight check is pretty dangerous, and the attack would continue from there. Say maybe knight check here, king over here, could have knight check, and the rook would have to give itself up anyway. So the rook goes ahead and takes. After rook takes f2, king g1, knight h3 check, king f1, queen g1 check, and the attack continues from here. White's king is out in the open. He does not have any protection from these 2 pieces. This knight is out of the game. This other knight is pinned to the queen, and this bishop is far away from the king. So black will be able to win very quickly from there. Alright, so therefore, if we do take on c5, bishop to b5 is not good. What about knight takes f8? Just trying to capture a little bit more material. Queen d4 check, king h1, knight takes d3, h3, trying to drive away the knight. Here we have knight check, rook must take, knight check, king h2. This is also another purpose of h3, to try and avoid having to go to g1 where there would be discovered checks with the knight. So therefore king out to h2, knight d3, and we can see that the position is approximately equal here. So this would have been white's best chance in this game, to take on c5 and go down this variation into a game that is close to equal. Possibilities, maybe white develops this bishop, and then we can see black taking the knight, stuff like that. Alright. So materially equal at the end of that variation. That's pretty hard to see though. So taking on c5 is good as long as knight takes f8 is played. Black's attack is pretty fast. So instead though, we see bishop out to e2 being played, just trying to hit this knight and maybe cause it to move back to get some breathing room around the white's king. But instead of defending the knight by moving it back, or by playing this other knight to f6, we see the knight moving out to e5, which is an extremely brilliant move. This knight cannot be captured, and I was running this with the computer to see what it would think, and it is not even, it takes a while for the computer to understand this move. At first glance, it doesn't understand why it's such a great move. But let's go ahead and take a look at this. Bishop g4 is played in the actual game. If d takes c5, queen d4 check. What about bishop e3? Just queen takes. So king h1, knight f2 check, rook takes, queen takes, and there's this idea of checkmate on g2. This idea is unstoppable. If bishop f3, then simply queen f1 is checkmate. If knight e4, trying to block this bishop from g2, then queen e1 is checkmate. So that is a very brilliant move played by Anand. The bishop here cannot be taken. D takes c5 is not possible, so why not f takes e5? Well, queen d4 check, and once again there is a checkmate. Queen g1, just sacrificing the queen. The rook has to take it because the queen is defended by the bishop. After rook takes, knight f2, smothered mate. That is pretty awesome. So this knight on e5 cannot be captured. Therefore, Aronian decides to capture this knight on g4 in order to try and give his king some breathing room. You know, when you have a really cramped position, when your wars trading off pieces can help stop the attack or make the attack easier to handle. Knight takes f8, f5, great move. It stops any ideas of queen h7 check, which would have given white some counterplay. Knight to g6, just trying to stop queen h4. If queen h4, g3 is not possible because of this bishop, so it'd be very difficult, probably impossible, to stop this checkmate. Therefore, the knight comes back to try and stop the queen from getting over to the h file. But Anand wants to get the queen over there anyway, so he plays queen f6. Here h3 is played, and other moves are not any better. h3 is trying to do something. It's looking to attack this knight, but it doesn't work either. At this point, Anand has a forced win, no matter what white plays. If white plays queen out to d3 here, queen g6, queen g3, just trying to hold everything together. Knight f2 check, and simply trading off material. Black is completely winning here. If the rook takes, just queen takes, and then we get into this endgame position where black has two bishops, a better pawn structure, and even some ideas of continuing the attack. So this endgame would be pretty easy to win. Therefore, that was not played, but that might have been a little bit better. That's probably the better choice, is queen out to d3. But what about simply knight e5? If knight e5, knight takes h2 is also winning. Here, what if maybe king h2, that would lead to a quick checkmate. That's not good. So how about rook f2, just trying to defend everything across this back rank and maybe trying to move the king out of danger. Queen h4, Let's just say, what about king g1, queen g3, and there is a checkmate on g2, main because this rook is pinned to the king, so it cannot defend g2. The checkmate is unstoppable. What about knight to g6, hitting the queen? Well, that doesn't work out either. Just queen h5, and moving the knight is a threat, followed by checkmate. So therefore the king moves over, knight f3 anyway. After pawn takes, bishop takes, there is a checkmate on h1, and it cannot be stopped because once again this rook is pinned to the king. So that is really a fascinating game. Therefore, that is not possible. Knight e5 is not good. Queen out to d3 might be a little bit better, but it does get into a losing endgame. Therefore h3 is tried. Queen g6 is played, and after queen e2, simply queen h5. It threatens to take on h3 with checkmate. That is unstoppable. There are some ways that white can try to hold on to the game. What about queen takes e6 check, getting a little bit of counterplay? Rook f3, just trying to defend h3. Bishop takes, and this is going to lead to a checkmate. There's no way to stop that. So queen takes pawn doesn't work. Rook f3 immediately doesn't work either. Just simply knight f2 check, king out, and once again black is able to get into an endgame where he has a much better pawn structure, and in this endgame would be up by a pawn. Not to mention white's pieces are still not developed, so black does have the advantage of time as well. So that doesn't work out either. In the actual game, we see queen out to d3 trying to defend h3 with the queen. That doesn't work either though, because of bishop e3 interference move. The queen can no longer defend this pawn. Knight defends the bishop, and here Aronian resigned. This is a really amazing game played by Anand. So much to look at here, so many different possible tactics and checkmates. Awesome, awesome game. Played in the Semi-Slav. Thank you for watching.